TSA agent confiscated the seasoned veteran's fake military ID until Homeland Security arrived and apologized. What happens when a young TSA agent mistakes a decorated war hero for a fraud? At Denver International Airport, one man's quiet dignity would clash with bureaucratic arrogance, leading to a confrontation that would shake the entire security checkpoint and remind everyone that true honor doesn't always come with fanfare. The fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport cast their familiar harsh glow over Terminal B as morning commuters shuffled through the security checkpoint. Among them, a man in his 70s moved with deliberate, measured steps. Harold Mitchell wore a simple flannel shirt, well-worn jeans, and scuffed leather boots that had seen decades of use. His weathered hands gripped a modest carry-on bag, and his salt-and-pepper beard framed a face marked by years of service and sacrifice. Harold approached the TSA checkpoint with the patience of someone who had learned that hurrying rarely improved anything. His military bearing was subtle, shoulders squared, head held high, but to most observers, he appeared to be just another elderly traveler making his way through the maze of modern air travel. The security line moved slowly, typical for a Tuesday morning. Business travelers tapped impatiently on their phones while families juggled luggage and restless children. Harold simply waited, observing the organized chaos with the calm detachment of someone who had seen far more stressful situations. Before continuing, give this story a like and subscribe to discover more tales of unsung heroes whose true worth often goes unrecognized until the moment it matters most. When Harold reached the document checkpoint, he was greeted by Marcus Thompson, a TSA agent in his mid-20s who had been on the job for 8 months. Marcus took pride in his attention to detail and his ability to spot inconsistencies that other agents might miss. His supervisor had recently commended him for catching several fraudulent documents, and he approached each passenger with the confidence of someone proving himself. "Good morning, sir. ID and boarding pass, please," Marcus said with professional courtesy. Harold reached into his wallet and produced his identification. Instead of a standard driver's license, he handed over a military ID card, a retired reserve ID card that granted him base privileges and identified him as Colonel Harold Mitchell, U.S. Army, retired. Marcus examined the card with growing suspicion. The lamination appeared different from what he expected, and the format seemed unusual compared to the standard military IDs he had encountered during training. The photograph showed a younger Harold, taken years earlier, and the wear on the card made some text difficult to read. "Sir, this doesn't look right," Marcus said, holding up the card. "The lamination is peeling, and this format isn't standard. Do you have another form of ID?" Harold's expression remained calm, though something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but the weariness of someone who had faced this type of skepticism before. "Son, that's my official military retiree ID. It's perfectly valid." "I'm going to need to have this verified," Marcus insisted, his voice carrying the authority he felt his position granted him. "This looks like it could be homemade. The edges are frayed, and I can't make out all the security features." Other passengers in line began to take notice as the conversation grew more tense. A woman with 2 young children shifted uncomfortably, while a businessman checked his watch with obvious irritation. Harold remained still, his hands clasped behind his back in a stance that spoke of decades of military discipline. "I understand you're doing your job," Harold said quietly, "but that identification has taken me through security checkpoints all over this country and overseas. It's legitimate." Marcus called over his supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, a 15-year TSA veteran who had seen her share of document disputes. She examined the ID with experienced eyes, noting the wear patterns and faded text. "Colonel Mitchell," she said, reading the name on the card, "this ID has seen better days. While it might be legitimate, we need to verify its authenticity given its condition." The line behind them grew longer as other agents directed passengers to different checkpoints. Harold stood with quiet dignity as his identification was scrutinized, photographed, and disgust among the growing group of TSA personnel. His military bearing never wavered, but those close enough could see the disappointment in his eyes, not at the delay, but at the assumption that a man who had served his country for decades would need to prove his identity with anything other than his word and his official documentation. The security checkpoint buzzed with growing tension as more TSA personnel gathered around Harold's case. Marcus, emboldened by his supervisor's support for verification procedures, had taken charge of the situation with the enthusiasm of someone eager to demonstrate his vigilance. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while we contact the appropriate authorities," Marcus announced, gesturing toward a separate screening area typically reserved for additional security checks. Harold's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Young man, I've been flying with this identification for over 15 years. Every major airport in this country has accepted it without question." "Well, things have changed," Marcus replied, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Security protocols are more stringent now. This card doesn't match our current database of approved military IDs, and frankly, it looks like something someone could have made at home." The comment hung in the air like a slap. Several passengers within earshot turned to stare, and Harold felt the familiar burn of disrespect that he had hoped his years of service had earned him the right to avoid. Janet Rodriguez sensed the situation escalating and attempted to mediate. "Let's all take a breath here. Colonel Mitchell, we're simply following protocol. With the condition of your ID, we need additional verification." "The condition reflects its use," Harold said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that suggested he was drawing from deep reserves of patience. "I've carried this card through 3 combat deployments, numerous training exercises, and countless trips to visit wounded soldiers in military hospitals. It's worn because it's been with me through service to this country." Marcus scoffed audibly. "Sir, with all due respect, anyone can claim military service. We see fake military IDs regularly, and this one exhibits several characteristics of fraudulent documents." A Marine Corps veteran waiting in a nearby line overheard the exchange and approached the checkpoint. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, still in uniform after a weekend training exercise, had been watching the interaction with growing concern. "Excuse me," she interjected, addressing Marcus directly. "I couldn't help but overhear. That gentleman is presenting a legitimate retired reserve ID card. The format and appearance are consistent with cards issued to long-term retirees." Marcus bristled at the interference. "Ma'am, I appreciate your input, but I'm trained to identify fraudulent documents. This card doesn't meet our current standards." Jennifer's expression hardened. "Those standards should include recognizing legitimate military identification regardless of age or wear. That card represents decades of service." Harold placed a gentle hand on Jennifer's arm. "It's all right, Sergeant. Let them do their job." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, and Jennifer immediately recognized the tone of a superior officer. The checkpoint supervisor, David Chen, arrived on scene after being alerted to the disruption. With 23 years of TSA experience and prior military service himself, Chen immediately recognized both the legitimacy of Harold's identification and the brewing public relations disaster. "What seems to be the problem here?" Chen asked, though he had already assessed the situation from across the terminal. Marcus eagerly explained his concerns about the suspicious military ID, while Harold stood silently, his bearing reflecting the dignity of someone who had faced far more serious challenges than a skeptical airport security agent. Chen examined the ID carefully, noting details that Marcus had missed: subtle security features, proper formatting, and wear patterns consistent with legitimate use over many years. "Agent Thompson," Chen said quietly, "this is a valid military retiree ID. The format is older but completely legitimate." Marcus's face flushed with embarrassment and defensiveness. "But sir, the condition of the card and the unusual lamination are exactly what you'd expect from a card that's been actively used by a military retiree for over a decade. Chen interrupted. Colonel Mitchell, I apologize for the delay. Harold nodded curtly, but remained in place as other passengers watched the drama unfold. The damage to his dignity felt more significant than any inconvenience to his travel schedule. I still think we should verify this through additional channels, Marcus insisted, unwilling to concede his position. Better safe than sorry. Chen's expression suggested he was rapidly losing patience with his subordinate's persistence, but protocol demanded they follow through with the verification process once it had been initiated. The secondary screening area felt like an interrogation room to Harold as he sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, watching TSA agents make phone calls and type reports about his suspicious identification. The humiliation stung more than he cared to admit, but decades of military discipline kept his emotions in check. Marcus had called the TSA hotline for document verification, speaking in hushed tones while periodically glancing at Harold with continued suspicion. The young agent seemed determined to prove his initial assessment correct, even as evidence mounted against his position. Sir, we're going to need some additional information, Marcus said, returning with a clipboard full of forms. Can you provide your social security number, military service number, and the names of your commanding officers? Harold's eyes flashed with controlled irritation. Son, I've provided valid identification. I'm not filling out interrogation forms to prove I served my country. Jennifer Walsh, the Marine who had attempted to intervene earlier, had missed her own flight to stay and support Harold. She sat nearby, her presence a silent reminder that not everyone questioned his legitimacy. This is ridiculous, she muttered, loud enough for Marcus to hear. The man's ID is legitimate. Anyone with basic military knowledge could verify that. Marcus ignored her comment and continued with his questions. Colonel Mitchell, what unit did you serve with? What were your deployment locations? Can you name the bases where you were stationed? Harold straightened in his chair, his military bearing becoming more pronounced. I served with the 82nd Airborne Division, 3rd Brigade Combat Team. I deployed to Iraq 3 times and Afghanistan twice. I was stationed at Fort Bragg, Fort Campbell, and Fort Benning during my career. I retired as a full colonel after 32 years of active duty and reserve service. The specificity and confidence of Harold's responses impressed several TSA agents who had gathered to observe the unusual situation. Marcus, however, remained skeptical. Anyone could look up that information online, he argued, though his voice carried less conviction than before. David Chen had been making his own phone calls, contacting TSA headquarters and military verification services. His expression grew increasingly grave as he gathered information about proper procedures and the potential consequences of mishandling a legitimate military retiree's identification. Thompson, Chen called Marcus aside, speaking in low, urgent tones. I've confirmed with 3 separate sources that Colonel Mitchell's ID is legitimate. We need to conclude this matter immediately. Marcus's face reddened with embarrassment and stubborn pride. I still think the condition of the card warrants additional scrutiny. If we're wrong and it is fake, we'll look incompetent. We already look incompetent, Chen replied sharply. We've detained a decorated veteran based on the assumption that a well-used military ID must be fraudulent. Meanwhile, Harold sat quietly, his weathered hands folded in his lap. He watched the agents debate his legitimacy with the patience of someone who had endured far worse indignities in service to his country. But beneath his calm exterior, disappointment grew, not at the delay, but at the realization that his decades of sacrifice meant so little to those sworn to protect the very freedoms he had fought to preserve. A commotion near the main checkpoint caught everyone's attention as 2 men in dark suits approached with purposeful strides. The distinctive bearing and professional demeanor immediately identified them as federal agents, and conversations throughout the screening area grew quiet. Agent Michael Harrison and Agent Lisa Park from Homeland Security investigations had been alerted to the situation by concerned passengers who had posted about the incident on social media. What had begun as a routine document verification had escalated into a potential public relations disaster requiring immediate attention. "Who's in charge here?" Agent Harrison asked, his authoritative voice cutting through the ambient noise of the checkpoint. David Chen stepped forward, his expression reflecting both relief and apprehension at the arrival of federal investigators. "I am David Chen, TSA checkpoint supervisor. We understand you have a question about military identification," Agent Park said, her eyes scanning the scene until they settled on Harold, who had risen from his chair with military precision. The arrival of Homeland Security agents transformed the atmosphere entirely. What had been a bureaucratic disagreement suddenly felt like a federal investigation, and Marcus Thompson realized his simple document check had spiraled far beyond his control. Agent Harrison approached Harold with the respectful demeanor of someone who understood military protocol. "Colonel Mitchell, I'm Agent Harrison with Homeland Security Investigations. I apologize that your travel has been disrupted." Harold stood at attention, his bearing reflecting decades of military discipline. "Agent Harrison, I assume you're here about the question regarding my identification." "We are indeed," Agent Park confirmed, producing her own credentials. "We've been monitoring the situation and felt it warranted our attention." Marcus Thompson stood nearby, his earlier confidence replaced by growing anxiety as he realized the magnitude of what was unfolding. The presence of federal agents suggested this was no longer a simple document verification, but something much more significant. Agent Harrison examined Harold's military ID with practiced expertise, immediately recognizing security features that Marcus had overlooked. "Colonel, this is a legitimate retired reserve ID card, issued in accordance with duty standards. The wear patterns and aging are consistent with regular use over many years." "That's what I've been trying to tell them," Harold replied quietly, his voice carrying both vindication and exhaustion. Agent Park turned to David Chen with a stern expression. "Supervisor Chen, can you explain why a legitimate military retiree has been detained for over an hour?" Chen glanced nervously at Marcus before responding. Agent Thompson initially questioned the authenticity of the ID due to its condition and formatting. "We were following standard verification procedures." "Standard procedures don't include assuming military identification is fraudulent simply because it shows we're from legitimate use," Agent Harrison stated firmly. "Colonel Mitchell's ID has been run through multiple databases, and his identity has been confirmed through military personnel records." Marcus finally spoke up, his voice defensive but shaky. The card looked suspicious. The lamination was peeling, and the format seemed outdated. "I was protecting airport security." Agent Park's expression hardened. "Agent Thompson, Colonel Mitchell served 32 years in the United States Army, including 5 combat deployments. He commanded troops in some of the most dangerous theaters of operation in Iraq and Afghanistan. His service record includes a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart." The revelation hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Passengers who had been watching the drama unfold began to understand they were witnessing the harassment of a genuine war hero. Several people pulled out their phones, not to record the confrontation, but to delete any social media posts that might have contributed to Harold's humiliation. Furthermore, Agent Harrison continued, "Colonel Mitchell has been instrumental in training security personnel at military installations worldwide. His expertise in identifying actual security threats far exceeds anything taught in basic TSA training." Harold remained silent, but Jennifer Walsh, the Marine who had stayed to support him, stepped forward. "Sir, if I may, Colonel Mitchell is well known in military circles. He's been a mentor to hundreds of junior officers and has received commendations from multiple commanding generals." Marcus looked stricken as the full weight of his error became clear. I was just doing my job. I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't ask the right questions, Agent Park replied. Instead of treating Colonel Mitchell with the respect due to a decorated veteran, you assumed he was attempting to defraud airport security. David Chen stepped forward, recognizing the need to take control of the situation. Colonel Mitchell, on behalf of the Transportation Security Administration, I offer our sincere apologies. This should never have happened. Harold nodded curtly, but said nothing. His silence spoke volumes about the depth of his disappointment, not in the delay, but in the realization that his service meant so little to those he had sworn to protect. Agent Harrison addressed the growing crowd of onlookers. Ladies and gentlemen, you've witnessed something that should concern all Americans. When we question the legitimacy of those who have served our country with distinction, we diminish the very values they fought to preserve. The checkpoint had grown quiet, except for the normal sounds of security screening. Passengers moved through other lanes, while casting respectful glances toward Harold, many now understanding they were in the presence of someone whose sacrifices had helped secure their freedom to travel safely. Marcus Thompson stood apart from the group, his earlier confidence replaced by the crushing realization that his zealous attention to duty had led him to humiliate a man whose service record far exceeded anything Marcus would ever achieve. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over the checkpoint like a heavy silence. Agent Harrison and Agent Park had concluded their investigation, confirming what should have been obvious from the beginning. Colonel Harold Mitchell was exactly who his identification claimed him to be, and his treatment had been both inappropriate and unnecessary. Colonel Mitchell, Agent Harrison said formally, your identification is completely valid, and you're free to proceed to your gate. Again, we apologize for this unfortunate incident. Harold retrieved his ID card and boarding pass with quiet dignity. Agent Harrison, I appreciate your intervention. This situation required more resources than it should have. David Chen approached Harold with visible remorse. Colonel, I want to personally ensure this never happens again. We'll be reviewing our training procedures immediately. Supervisor Chen, Harold replied, his voice steady but firm, the issue isn't your procedures. It's the assumption that someone would fabricate military service for the trivial benefit of easier airport screening. That assumption dishonors every person who has worn the uniform. Marcus Thompson stood nearby, his face pale with embarrassment and growing understanding of his mistake. He had spent the morning treating a decorated war hero like a common fraud, and the weight of that realization was crushing. Sir, Marcus said quietly, stepping forward, I need to apologize. I was wrong. Harold studied the young TSA agent for a long moment. Son, you were doing what you thought was right, but next time, remember that people who have genuinely served this country don't generally try to fake their way through airport security. We've already earned our way through. Jennifer Walsh, who had missed her connecting flight to stand by Harold, finally spoke. Colonel, thank you for your service, sir. What happened here today was wrong, but your dignity throughout this ordeal has been an example to all of us. Harold nodded acknowledgement. Sergeant Walsh, thank you for your support. Your willingness to speak up demonstrates the values we try to instill in every service member. As Harold gathered his belongings to proceed to his gate, Agent Park addressed the crowd of passengers and TSA personnel who had witnessed the incident. What happened here today should remind all of us that service and sacrifice don't always come with fanfare. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the quiet ones, carrying worn identification cards that tell stories of dedication most of us can't imagine. David Chen called all TSA personnel in the area together for an impromptu briefing. Today we learned an important lesson about respect and assumptions. Colonel Mitchell handled this situation with more grace than many of us would have shown. We need to do better. Marcus Thompson approached Harold one final time as the colonel prepared to leave the security area. Sir, is there anything I can do to make this right? Harold paused, considering the question with the thoughtfulness of someone accustomed to teaching important lessons. Agent Thompson learned from this. Not everyone who serves makes it obvious. Some of the most dedicated people I've known were the quiet ones who never sought recognition. Don't let someone's humble appearance fool you into thinking they haven't accomplished great things. As Harold walked toward his gate, other passengers stepped aside respectfully, many nodding in acknowledgement of his service. The earlier confrontation had transformed into an unexpected lesson about honor, respect, and the danger of making assumptions about people's worth based on appearances. Agent Harrison watched Harold disappear into the crowd of travelers. That gentleman handled himself with more dignity than most people would have managed. His service record reads like a textbook of military excellence, but you'd never know it from talking to him. The incident at Denver International Airport would become a training case study for TSA personnel nationwide, but its true impact was more personal. Marcus Thompson would never again question military identification without proper cause. David Chen would revise screening protocols